Hello YouTube. This video is about a most unusual person who lived in the 18th century and possessed an incredible talent. This is my investigation. Mauritius is an island nation in the Indian Ocean, about 2,000 kilometers or 1,200 miles off the southeast coast of the African continent, east of Madagascar. Let me start with the Soviet sources, with research of Nikolai Nepomniachtchi, a Russian explorer, writer, and researcher of the historical enigmas. There was one more Soviet source to this curious tale that I found, a Ukrainian scientist Alexander Kursky, but his account is not that different from the Russian one. So, the port office was located on the shore, a dozen meters from the surf edge. On June 20, 1782, the weather was excellent. The official of the office, Etienne Batino, stared into the distance for a long time, then walked along the shore and looked again towards the sea. His actions were closely watched by dozens of curious residents. Everyone was waiting for a miracle. Batino walked over to the office and opened the door. "Well, what is it?" the manager inside asked. "It's all right," Batino replied. "There are no ships in sight yet, but I have a feeling that in 4 or 5 days they will enter the port." The ships did not appear within the specified period. They didn't appear a week later. Ridicule was raining down on Batino. The ships of the French squadron entered Port Louis 9 days later. They were delayed by calm weather, absence of marine winds. Many experts in the history of the island of Mauritius do not even suspect about Etienne Batino and his amazing predictions. The only mention of it in Russian is given in the book of the South African writer Lawrence Green, titled Islands Time Forgot. I will speak more about Green, but later in this video. In general, the inhabitants of the island, so inconspicuous next to the huge Madagascar, should not complain about the lack of literature about their homeland. There are reports of the first Portuguese and Dutch travelers, sketches of famous European artists, governors' reports, scientific reports of geologists, zoologists, and geographers, works of world-famous writers like Mark Twain, Joseph Conrad, who lived there at one time. There are records of British, French, and other naval commanders. And before them, there were Arab merchants and Indonesian sailors there before. There are many unusual things in Mauritius. It was here that a huge turkey-like wingless dodo bird lived, exterminated long before the establishments of the Red Book. The local culture is amazing. It's a bizarre mixture of Indian, Chinese, English, and African customs and languages. I will tell you more about this remarkable island because this may be important to this phenomenon we're going to speak about, and more, but later in this video. Let's focus on Batino. Although the literature about Mauritius has thousands of books and articles, it was not easy for the Russian writer Nepomniachtchi to find additional information about Etienne Batino. Requests to the largest libraries in the world did not give anything, he said. A refusal was received from the Library of Congress, Washington, and another refusal was also received from the Library of the British Museum of London. There was no information in the Museum of Man in Paris, and suddenly, when hope was almost extinguished, a package arrived from Port Louis, and in it photocopies of historical documents. Information about Batino gleaned from the State National Archive of Mauritius. According to the Biographical Dictionary of the Mauritians, published in Port Louis in 1955, the French Etienne Batino was born in 1739 in the French town of Chantozo and died in Mauritius on May 17, 1813. In 1762, on board one of the ships of the Royal French Navy, he came up with the idea that moving ships should produce a certain effect in the atmosphere. A year later, Batino arrived in the Ile-de-France, as Mauritius was formerly called, and a year later received the position of engineer. Captivated by the clear sky at a greater time of day and the fact that only a few ships passed near the island without appearing within sight, Batino resumed his experiments. After 6 months, he was so successful in training that he began to make bets. Without a telescope at all, he predicted the appearance of any ships on the horizon in 2 or 3 days from the time that the bets were placed. In 1780, Batino reported his abilities to the French Maritime Ministry, to Marshal de Castries, and I'm sorry for my pronunciation, it's horrible French, but I'll do my best. Anyway, he ordered to register all observations of Batino for 2 years. By the way, they began on May 15, 1762, all those observations. On that day, Batino then announced the imminent appearance of 3 ships, which arrived on May 17, 18, and 26. And then there was the very incident from which our story began. Batino estimated his secret to be at 100,000 livres, plus an annual allowance of 1,200 livres. After all, from the years 1778 to 1782, he predicted the arrival of 575 ships 4 days before they appeared within sight. However, the governor, instead of the requested money, handed Batino a letter of recommendation and sent him to France. During the voyage to Europe, he surprised the crew and passengers a lot, guessing the appearance of 27 oncoming ships, and repeatedly stated that he could determine the proximity of the earth hidden behind the horizon. Of land hidden behind the horizon. Once he warned the captain that the land, indistinguishable to the naked eye, was no more than 30 leagues away. The captain said it couldn't be, Batino wrote. However, after carefully reviewing the navigation calculations, I had to admit that an error crept into them and immediately changed course. Along the way, I identified the land 3 times, once at a distance of 150 leagues. And to be clear, it was the captain who admitted the mistake. In July of 1784, Batino arrived in France, but he could not get an audience with the minister. But he did not waste time in vain and entertained the audience of Lorient in every possible way, habitually applying his abilities in the harbor of this town. And the bulletin of the Mercury de France published excerpts from Monsieur Batino's own memoirs about nauscopia, or sea vision. This is the name that Batino gave to his mysterious gift. Jean-Paul Marat, who was writing treatise on physics for the same publication at that time, became interested in the abilities of the employee from a distant island in the Indian Ocean. Marat reported about Batino's talents to London, but he never managed to visit England, Batino. In June 1793, Batino returned to Mauritius, where many citizens asked him to continue his experiments on nauscopy. Batino was very vague about the essence of his methods. A ship approaching the shore produces a certain effect on the atmosphere, he wrote to Marat, and as a result, its approach can be detected by an experienced eye before the ship reaches the limits of visibility. My predictions were favored by the clear sky and a clear atmosphere that prevail most of the year in the Ile-de-France. I stayed on the island for 6 months until I was convinced of my discovery, and it only remained to gain experience so that nauscopy would become a true science. In Mauritius, Batino found a follower. On November 22, 1810, a resident of Pamplemousse, someone named Fayafé, who had previously worked for Batino and whose observation point was the top of Montagne Longue, discovered, according to him, that English fleet was heading towards Ile-de-France. A little later, Fayaffe clearly recognized a cluster of ships in the northeast that were moving towards the island of Rodriguez, but could not determine the exact number of them. He continued to observe and was convinced of his correctness when the fleet came closer, although it had not yet appeared on the horizon. Fayaffe went to Port Louis. In 48 hours, he said, we will see the English fleet. Panic broke out in the city. Fayaffe was put behind bars because of the spread of false rumors. But just in case, they sent a ship to Rodriguez to find out what was happening there. But it was too late. On November 26th, first 20 and then another 34 ships of the British Royal Navy appeared off the coast of Ile-de-France. Fayaffe was released only after the capture of the island by the British. The Mauritian historian Pierre de Sornay, who told about this episode in his book, believes that Fayaffe was probably the only one who was taught by Batino this amazing, one might say it, art or skill, call it what you want. There is a scant information about the mysterious talent of Etienne Batino in the secret memoirs that serve to cover the history of the Republic from 1764 to the present day. In the 12th volume of this peculiar chronicle of France of the 18th century, there is an entry dated April 30, 1785. Monsieur Batino, an old employee of the East India Company on the islands of Ile-de-France and Bourbon, has just published a note to the government in which he insists that he has found a physical method of detecting ships at distances up to 250 leagues. He opened it about 20 years ago. I studied it, went through the path of mistakes and uncertainty, acted by touch until I achieved success. I began to inform in advance about the arrival of the ships, their number and distance from the coast. Of the 155 ships whose arrival was predicted by Batino, and the figure is greatly underestimated compared to other data, half came to the ports, and as for the rest, he gave this explanation. Winds, combat, or other obstacle prompted the captains to unexpectedly change course. One of Batino's most impressive results was the prediction of the appearance of the English fleet, including a corvette and a frigate, which arrived 2 days later. The fact was mentioned by officers and admirals who were on the islands at that time. And here's an entry from July 28, 1785. Batino, in one of the letters, explained his phenomenal abilities by the fact that he graduated from the School of Animal Magnetism in Colombo, where he lived and communicated with Hindus who can work miracles. In Paris, Count de Ségur, who ridiculed all hypnotists in general, laughed at Batino's abilities. And finally, the message of March 1st, 1786. Here are excerpts from Monsieur Batino's own memoirs about Nauscopia. The distinguished public can recall my experiments made in July 1783 with a large crowd of people, as well as organized by the Société Populaire of the city of Port Louis in May 1784. However, this did not guarantee me from attacks. I was ridiculed in those cases when I predicted the arrival of a ship and it did not appear. The answer here is simple. It was not going to our island. These people, in whose actions there is no glimmer of thought, do not believe anything, doubting everything, ridicule everything, say that I am a charlatan, and what I am doing cannot be. I am forced to live among this rabble, stupid and cruel people who are mired in routine, who are hostile to any discovery and even news that falls at least one iota out of their primitive understanding of the world. Meanwhile, newspaper reports and entries in ship logs of the late 18th century and early 19th century indicate that Batino predicted the arrival or near passage of ships. In his memoirs, of which fragments have come down to us, Batino bitterly complains about the atmosphere of misunderstanding, disbelief in his abilities surrounding him. I have become another victim of the colonial routine on remote islands, forgotten by God and science, which suffer from despotisms of officials, he wrote. If irritation and disappointment cause my demise before I can explain my discovery, then the whole world will lose for some time the knowledge about art that would have done honor to the 18th century. And so it happened. Batino died without trusting anyone with his secrets. But what is the essence of his discovery? Well, let's look at the opinions of scientists for now. Modern researchers who have studied the Batino phenomenon mainly speak in favor of atmospheric effects. At first glance, their reasoning seems quite reasonable. From the heating by the sun, the vapors of the ocean water rise to a considerable height, condense and form clouds. In the wake of the jet left by the ships, this evaporation is greater and fountains of steam turn high in the sky into small wisps of clouds. In clear sunny weather near the equator, such atmospheric formations occur at an altitude of up to 18 to 20 kilometers and can be seen at a great distance. Therefore, Batino and Fayaffe did not observe mirage, but precisely some results of the impact on the atmosphere above the place of movement of ships. By the way, Batino could judge the number of sailing ships by the number of clouds. As for the huge distance of hundreds of kilometers from Mauritius to the place of passage of the ships, this does not confuse the authors of the atmospheric hypothesis. A person with sharp eyesight is able to detect even the satellites of distant planets, they say. For example, experts believe that an ancient Chinese astronomer observed the satellite of Jupiter with the naked eye almost 2,000 years earlier than Galileo, who used an optical device for this. However, none of the Batino's contemporaries noticed such amazing farsightedness in him. The most important thing is that an explanation has been found for even the most mysterious fact. How Batino determined the nationality of the ships. Okay? The engineer knew well the English and French ships, and probably the ships of other countries. They differed from each other, not only in shape, but also in the speed of movement. This affected their impact on the atmosphere. Here it should be noted at once that in fact all the ships at that time had similar seaworthiness and consequently speed. Therefore, there simply could not be any noticeable difference in their effect on the atmosphere. As a confirmation of their hypothesis, its supporters refer to an unusual phenomenon, messenger clouds, which are observed in the Sahara deserts. Tuaregs living there, when small clouds appear on the horizon and the oblong shape, they say that a caravan will come soon. And they're right. After a few hours, the silhouettes of camels appear on the horizon. That is, from a caravan moving in a sandy sea, the same effect is observed as from the ships sailing in the ocean expanses. But there are also more serious arguments in favor of the atmospheric hypothesis. At one time, Soviet author Paderin reported in the magazine Siberian Lights that when studying a series of photos of the ocean delivered from the near-Earth orbit by Soviet cosmonauts, two images attracted the attention of specialists. On one, a passenger ship got into the frame, and behind the ship was a breakwater stream. It was swirling. On the other, taken on the next turn, a chain of clouds formed over this section of the ocean and accurately copying the configuration of the ship's route. It follows from this message that firstly, the reaction of the atmosphere to the interaction of the ship with the ocean is very fast. And secondly, the chain of clouds appearing over the ocean accurately copies the configuration of the ship's route. Well, if this is so, then Batino and Fayafay, apparently it was by the appearance of the clouds in the sky that they concluded about the approach of ships and their number. And by the speed of clouds over the ocean, they judged the speed of ships. However, the atmospheric hypothesis does not take into account a very important factor. Batino made his predictions not only in Mauritius, but also on the coast of France, where there are many more clouds over the Atlantic than in the cloudless sky near the equator, and it is almost impossible to distinguish which of them are the traces of ships. And Batino was going to look for confirmation of his nauscopy in England. Experts in the physics of dynamic processes in the atmosphere unanimously declared that a small wooden vessel that does not have a steam power plant and moves very slow cannot have any noticeable effect on the air environment above it. Okay, imagine observing the same in England with its weather and clouds in the sky continuously. Also, such wooden ships, they do not leave behind a high breakwater over which fountains of evaporating water would form, as is the case with the modern very large and high-speed vessels. By the way, we recall, that the first steamship Clermont was launched in the United States only in 1807. However, meteorology here most likely has nothing to do with this phenomenon at all. There is a hypothesis that both clairvoyance and prognostics are the result of human contact with the global information field, which contains information about everything that has happened, is happening, or will happen. Moreover, such contact is facilitated when a person is in a state of altered consciousness, a kind of trance. The French engineer also peered into the sea thinking about ships, and whether he actually saw them or only imagined it, it's not so important. Let's move on. As for Batino's own reference to certain phenomena of an atmospheric or meteorological nature, then one can only guess what caused it. In parapsychology, there are examples when a person attributes a non-sensory input on information to his sensory channels, because his consciousness refuses to recognize such a phenomenon. But as already mentioned, it is possible that Batino specifically did not want to disclose how he predicts arrival of the vessels, so as not to be accused of having ties with the devil. We're speaking about the 18th century. Now, on to another source, one that is somewhat intertwined with my life. In the 1980s, I picked up 2 books in Cape Town that I have kept ever since and refer to them when writing about Africa. The books of Lawrence George Green, who passed away in 1972. He was a South African journalist and author, shunning any grandiose view of his literature and his way of life. He wrote for the layman and general reading entertainment as a storyteller. As such, his writings, though well populated with research fact through his wide travels and many hours of research in South African and British archives, his writings do not constitute in any strict sense historical or academic reference works. Nevertheless, he remains frequently cited as a recorder of little remembered or noted fact of some historical or cultural significance in the southern African domain. But I did not know that there were translations of his books in the USSR available in my native Russian. I found that out many years later. And I gotta tell you, it would be great if Green's books were available in other languages. For those interested in the strange phenomena of Africa and in the history of Southern Africa. And for those interested in what's going on in the islands around Africa, or before the history of the islands, I recommend Green's books. So here's what he wrote about Batino in the book Islands Time Forgot, 1962. That was the first publication. In Russia it was published in 1972. Острова нетронутые временем was the title. Anyway, in the chapter 18, I believe it was called On the Mascarenas, here's what he said. The period of French rule in Mauritius is marked by a mysterious person named Etienne Batino, whose secret has never been revealed. The fact is that Batino always knew in advance when this or that ship would arrive on the island. The Port Louis post office keeps old registers. Like many other astonished visitors, I looked through these books dated 1778 to 1782 and found records in which the arrival of almost 600 ships was anticipated. And each time their arrival, the largest gap between the predicted and the actual deadline was 4 days. Each time their arrival was confirmed by the signatures of responsible port officials. Okay, here I will skip other narrative that Green has because it's similar to what the Russian author had written about Batino. Let me continue Green's words from here. It is a pity that Batino refused the 10,000 livres and the pension offered to him by the governor. Okay? Now, this might have helped to solve the mystery that amazes everyone who has viewed the pages with records that undoubtedly confirmed Batino's art. I read the testimony of an eyewitness, de Souliac, an excerpt from which I quote, "Since the war began, he often made his statements accurate enough to make a sensation on the island. We talked with him about the reality of his science. It would be unfair to dismiss all this as quackery. We can confirm that Monsieur Batino was almost always right." Thus, the secret of Batino's art is still unknown, although there are several theoretical explanations for this. One researcher believes that Batino's predictions generated mirage that appeared in the tropics. Another version is based on a telepathic connection between Batino and the relevant subjects on the approaching ships. I'm not inclined to seek explanation in simple coincidences. There were too many of them for a long time. It seems to me that Batino was gifted with the gift of insight that the Bushmen and some other African peoples have. He could read such weak signals that people usually do not distinguish. It would be strange to assume that Batino's gift was not known either before or after him. After all, there were people who could guess by water or had other abilities that lay beyond the limits of human sensory perceptions. For example, I was not at all surprised when I read in a respectable London magazine about an African who lived on the island of Turks in the West Indies at the end of the 19th century. Every year he predicted to his tribesmen the arrival time of sailing schooners coming from the Newfoundland with a cargo of salted fish. This African always carried with him an object like a bamboo harp and claimed that airwaves emanated from the schooners, which can be detected by the sounds that arise in the split bamboo. Perhaps there is a Batino among us who will one day part with his secret without demanding 10,000 livres for it. So let's leave Green's narrative. Basically, the story is not that much different from the one that the Russian researcher presented too. But it's very interesting, especially when it comes to telepathic abilities of people in Africa. Look, I have researched to the extent possible such abilities of the indigenous people of Southwest Africa, but my field work was very limited, almost nothing, if you compare it to what others did, like, for example, Lawrence Green. But if you want to find out fascinating secrets of old Africa, I recommend Lawrence Green books. You will learn about phenomena that you did not know could exist, but they exist. Africa is a mesmerizing, captivating continent with history that we know just partially, especially ancient history, and the discoveries that are being made by archaeologists in the last few years are great. I will also describe very interesting but little known events and phenomena of at least one island in the French overseas territory, not that far away from Mauritius. Prepare to be amazed. There is a definite international intrigue flavor. And by the way, green was one of the sources that led me to my research, and Ivan Yefremov led me to Southwest Africa many years ago. But that's for later videos. Now I want to tell you about Mauritius, because it is a wonder, and because it is relatively close to Madagascar, itself a most curious and unusual place. We will explore it one day, but there is a reason I want to talk about Mauritius. I mentioned that it's an island nation, and that it includes the main island, also called Mauritius, as well as Rodriguez, Agalega, and Saint Brandon Islands. The islands of Mauritius, along with the nearby Réunion, a French overseas department, are part of the Mascarene Islands. The capital and the largest city, Port Louis, is located in Mauritius, where most of the population is concentrated. Arab sailors were the first to discover this uninhabited island around 975 AD. They called it Dina Arobi. Later, the Portuguese arrived with 16th century, the Dutch, the French, and the British followed through the centuries. Mauritius is almost entirely surrounded by coral reefs. There is a 177 kilometer or 110 miles of coastline, much of it covered by white sandy beaches. I heard some of the most beautiful beaches of this world. Mauritius was the only known habitat of the dodo bird. Dutch sailors likely first encountered this flightless bird in 1598. Within 100 years, rats from ships and other introduced animals had wiped out the species. The last confirmed sightings were in 1660s. One of the most interesting facts about Mauritius is that it's home to a spectacular underwater waterfall. From the air, actually, it looks like a heart-stopping canyon that cracks open meters from the peninsula. But the phenomenon is just an optical illusion caused by the runoff of sand and silt. Mauritius, by the way, was considered to be a volcanic island that first came up from the waves 8 million years ago. But as of 2017, we learned that a 3 billion year old lost continent lurks beneath the Indian Ocean island of Mauritius. Sparkly, iridescent flecks of rocks known as zircons from Mauritius date back billions of years to one of the earliest periods in Earth history. Other rocks on the island, by contrast, are no more than 9 million years old. The fact that we have found zircons of this age proves that there are much older crustal materials under Mauritius that could only have originated from a continent, according to the lead author of the new study from 2017, Louis Ashwell, geologist at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. Mauritius was sitting on top of a supercontinent called Gondwana, which can be dated back to at least 200 million years. The island is believed to have gradually split into India, Antarctica, South America, Africa, and Australia about 180 million years ago. Since the breaking apart of the supercontinent Gondwana happened 120 million years ago, when India started moving north, leading to the opening up of the Indian Ocean between Mauritius and the Indian subcontinent, what was left behind was a flurry of now extinct microcontinents. One of these has now been discovered and is now with Mauritius called Mauritia. Geological studies have found that most of Mauritius is completely barren and lost in the Indian Ocean. I've mentioned to you Russian research of the Indian Ocean because that's my expertise, things that took place in the USSR and post-Soviet countries. But you should pay more attention to the Indian Ocean. Look at my videos about revelations of cosmonaut Pavel Popovich and some other developments. Anyway, also in Mauritius, it's just interesting. I believe it's called seven-colored earths. It's a rare geological oddity that proves there are different colors for dirt. Surrounded by forests and spreading out in seven distinct colors, brown, red, violet, green, blue, purple, and yellow, these psychedelic dunes were formed thanks to a rare confluence of volcanic activity which brought a number of different elements together, each with their own distinct hue. The rolling bands of color are caused by a strange phenomenon in which the different sand particles seem to miraculously settle together, actually creating patches of red iron, blue aluminum. And what's interesting is that those dunes, they don't seem to erode despite Mauritius' heavy and frequent rains. The natural beauty of the site has attracted a healthy tourist trade, of course, and there's a wooden fence now. It was put up to protect the sands. My question is this: so there were volcanoes anyway on the ancient Gondwana later. How did this island come up? I'm sure the scientists are trying to answer that too, but we'll take what they say in 2017. You should know that Mark Twain, the famous American author, reportedly said, "You gathered the idea that Mauritius was made first, and then heaven, and that heaven was copied after Mauritius." Well, but the fascinating island was most likely only a setting for Batino's gift, not the cause of it, not the cause of the talent or ability, and we know. And here's what I find interesting. Remember, Batino in one of the letters explained his phenomenal abilities by the fact that he graduated from the School of Animal Magnetism in Colombo, where he lived and communicated with Hindus who can work miracles. Well, Mauritius is a multi-ethnic society drawn from Indian, mostly Bhojpuri origin, African, Chinese, and European, mostly French origin. Maybe Batino continued his education with sages from India who were moved, so to say, to the island. In 1715, Mauritius was claimed by France, but it wasn't until 1721 that French settlers from Réunion made the first attempt at settling the island they named Ile-de-France. Initially, they faced problems similar to the Dutch, and by 1735, the island was inhabited just by 838 people, of whom 648 were slaves. During the first years of French rule, a very multi-ethnic population was created, as people from India, Madagascar, Europe, Africa, and China were moved to the island. That's what some historical records say. The 1735 arrival of La Bourdonnais, the French governor, turned the tide and brought in the large-scale development of the land. African slaves and Indian craftsmen were brought in to this island. During the first years of French rule, a very multi-ethnic population was created. Okay? So maybe one of the craftsmen brought from India, this one of the indentured laborers, was the talent that French officer developed. Maybe he got it from people from India that he again encountered in his travels, so to say, and continued. So that means that there are talents out there that we can't even imagine, but we should keep looking. So I hope you like this video, and if you can support my research, you will find links to the description of this video. I have to tell you about an amazing person, a super being, so to say, who lived in Russia in the 18th century, and I will. It was a fabulous century, full of adventures, full of conquests and wars and intrigues, and also paranormal phenomena. I thank you for your support to my research, and please subscribe to my channel and tell others.